The day Emma Bailey walked into Dusty Creek's only saloon with her chin raised and her hands trembling beneath her skirts was the day everything in that tired little town changed forever. It was the spring of 1883, and Dusty Creek, Texas, was the kind of place that remembered everything and forgave nothing. Settled in the dry crease between two low hills on the edge of the Llano Estacado, the town had been built on cattle money and stubborn pride, and its people wore both like second skin. The main street ran straight and wide, churned to pale dust by wagon wheels and horse hooves, lined with a general store, a barber shop, a telegraph office, a church with a crooked steeple, and at the far end the Silver Spur Saloon, which was where most of the town's real business got conducted regardless of what anyone admitted on Sunday mornings. Emma Bailey was 24 years old and had lived in Dusty Creek her entire life, which meant she had spent 24 years watching the town decide exactly who she was supposed to be. She was the daughter of Joseph Bailey, who had died 3 years prior from a fever that swept through in the autumn of 1880, leaving her the small ranch on the eastern edge of town, and a debt that pressed on her chest every morning when she woke. She was neither a widow nor a bride, neither a seamstress nor a schoolteacher, and that unsettled people who liked their categories neat. She worked her land, she kept her fences, she haggled with the cattle buyers herself, and she did not lower her eyes when men spoke to her. And for all of this the town of Dusty Creek had decided she was difficult. The gossip had started slowly, the way fires always did in dry country. A murmur here, a whispered observation there. By the winter of 1882, it had caught and spread until it was a proper blaze. They said Emma Bailey thought herself better than everyone. They said she had turned down 3 decent proposals, including one from Franklin Holt, whose father owned half the grazing land north of the river, and that proved she was either foolish or proud or both. They said she kept too much to herself, and that a woman alone on a ranch was unseemly. Mrs. Caldwell at the Mercantile had taken to giving Emma tight smiles and slow service. Reverend Hatch's wife had stopped inviting her to the women's quilting circle. And when Emma walked down the main street, she could hear conversations shifting, eyes cutting sideways, and the particular silence that was worse than any spoken unkindness. She endured it the way she endured everything, by setting her jaw and moving forward. But endurance had its limits, and Emma had reached hers on a Tuesday afternoon in April when she overheard Mrs. Caldwell telling a customer that Emma Bailey would end up an old spinster on a failing ranch because she was too headstrong for any good man to want, and that it was her own fault entirely for putting on airs. Emma stood outside the Mercantile door for a long moment, the words settling into her like cold water. Then she walked home across the sun-baked road, sat down at her kitchen table, and pressed her palms flat against the scarred wood until she had thought her way through to a decision. The town's spring founders' dance was in 2 weeks. Every family in Dusty Creek attended, every rancher and shopkeeper and hired hand who could afford a clean shirt. It was held in the old barn behind the church, which got swept out and hung with lanterns every year, and there was a fiddle player named Old Clarence who could make any room want to move. Emma had attended every year of her adult life, and had spent most of those evenings standing near the punch table watching other people live their lives. This year she was going to dance, not alone, not quietly. She was going to walk in on the arm of someone the whole town would notice, and she was going to dance in the middle of that floor where everyone could see her, and she was going to look like a woman who was not one bit ashamed of herself. The trouble was finding a willing partner. Her friend Clara Watkins, who ran the laundry on the south side of town, and was one of perhaps 3 people in Dusty Creek who had not turned against Emma, came by the ranch on Thursday afternoon with a basket of dried beans and an expression that said she already knew what Emma was thinking. "You are going to do something dramatic," Clara said, sitting down across from Emma at the kitchen table. "I am going to go to the dance," Emma said, "That is the question I am working on. Clara was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. She was 31, broad-shouldered and practical in the way that only women who did hard work could be. She thought before she spoke, which Emma valued enormously. "You could ask Dexter Mercer," Clara said. Emma looked up. "The man who bought the old Weston property, the same." Dexter Mercer had arrived in Dusty Creek in February, and in 2 months had managed to be talked about almost as much as Emma herself, though for entirely different reasons. He had ridden in from the direction of San Antonio on a bay horse, with a bedroll and a reputation that had preceded him in fragments. People said he had been a ranch foreman down south, that he was good with horses and better with a cattle operation, that he had bought the old Weston spread on the northern edge of town, with honest money earned over years of honest work. He was 31 years old, tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his neck and gray eyes that had a habit of looking at things longer than most people thought polite. He wore a worn brown hat and kept to himself in a way that read as quiet dignity rather than antisocial tendencies, which the town had not yet decided how to categorize. What Dusty Creek had noted with considerable interest was that Dexter Mercer was not married and was not courting anyone, and that half the women in town with marriageable daughters had already found reasons to visit the northern end of town with baked goods and carefully casual conversation. He had been polite to all of them, Clara reported, and had accepted the baked goods and had given nothing away whatsoever. "I do not know him," Emma said. "You know of him, and he is new enough that he does not have an opinion about you yet. He has not been here long enough to absorb all the gossip. He has been here 2 months. He has had time. But he does not strike me as the gossip-absorbing type," Clara said. "He is at the Silver Spur on Friday evenings. You could go and ask him." Emma sat with that for a while. The idea of walking into the Silver Spur, which was a man's space with only the most deliberate exceptions, and asking a near stranger to escort her to the founder's dance, was the kind of thing that would generate more gossip if she was turned down, but the kind of thing that might, if it went well, shift the entire story the town was telling about her. "If he says no," Emma said slowly, "it will be worse than if I had not gone at all." "Yes," Clara agreed, "but I do not think he will say no." "What makes you say that?" Clara smiled in a way that suggested she knew more than she was sharing. "I have done his laundry twice now. He is a man who irons his shirts before he goes out, even when there is no occasion. A man like that does not say no to a dance." Emma laughed, which was a sound that had not visited her kitchen in some time. It felt strange and good in equal measure. She spent the rest of the week working the ranch, mending the south fence line where the posts had gone soft from winter wet, negotiating with her hired man, a quiet fellow named Pete Grady who had been with the Bailey land since before her father died, and who was unfailingly loyal and blessedly free of opinions about Emma's choices. She thought about what she was going to say to Dexter Mercer, and she rehearsed it in her head while she worked, and each version sounded either too bold or too timid, and she eventually decided to say it plainly and let it land where it would. Friday evening came around with the particular golden light that April saved for its best moments, and Emma put on her good green dress, which had a high collar and fitted sleeves, and which she knew suited her because her mother had told her so, and her mother had been a woman of honest opinions. She braided her dark hair up, pinned her mother's small cameo brooch at her collar, and walked the 3/4 of a mile into town in the warm evening air, thinking hard about courage and what it was made of. The Silver Spur was lit from within, spilling warm yellow light and the low murmur of male voices out onto the boardwalk. Emma pushed through the door with the confidence she had assembled on the walk over, and the room went quiet the way rooms did when something unexpected entered them. It was not a large saloon. There was a bar along the left wall, a scattering of round tables, a small platform in the back corner where musicians sometimes played. The air smelled of tobacco smoke and whiskey and sawdust, and the particular human warmth of a room full of men at the end of a working week. About 15 men were present, and every one of them was now watching Emma Bailey stand just inside the door. She saw Franklin Holt at a table in the middle of the room with two of his ranch hands, and she watched his eyebrows climb up his forehead. She saw Jeb Morrison from the telegraph office, who would carry whatever happened here to every conversation he had for the next month. She saw, at the bar, his back half turned to the door, a tall man in a brown hat nursing a glass of something amber. Emma walked to the bar. The bartender, a stocky man named Gus who had the expression of someone who had seen everything and was not much surprised by any of it, watched her approach with professional neutrality. She was grateful for that. "Miss Bailey," Gus said. "Good evening, Gus. I will take a glass of your lemonade, please." She had heard he kept lemons, which was a minor miracle in West Texas and a testament to his commitment to offering options. "Yes, ma'am." She turned, leaning slightly against the bar in a posture she hoped looked casual and not terrified, and looked at the man beside her. He had turned at the sound of her name, and now she was looking at gray eyes that were steady and direct and not unkind. "You are Dexter Mercer," she said. "I am," he said. He had a low, unhurried voice. "I am Emma Bailey. I own the Bailey Ranch on the eastern edge of town." "I know who you are," he said, and there was nothing in his tone she could find fault with. It was simply a fact. "Then I will not waste your time with introductions and get directly to the point." She accepted her lemonade from Gus and took a small sip and was glad to find it properly made. "The Founders' Dance is in 2 weeks. I intend to attend, and I would like to attend with an escort. I am asking if you would be willing to serve in that capacity." The room behind her had not resumed its normal volume. She was aware of 15 pairs of ears aimed in their direction. Dexter Mercer looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she made herself hold his gaze. "That is a direct question," he said. "I am a direct woman." "I have heard that." He turned his glass slowly on the bar. "Can I ask you something in return?" "You may." "Why me?" "You know perhaps a dozen men in this town better than you know me." Emma considered her answer. She had several prepared, and she discarded all of them because he was looking at her with those steady gray eyes, and she thought a man who asked a straight question deserved a straight answer. "Because you are new," she said. "You do not have a formed opinion of me yet, or if you do, it is not one that has been built up over years of other people's talk. And because I was told you are a man of some character, and a request like this requires a man of character." He was quiet again. She watched the corner of his mouth. "Just one dance?" he asked. "I was thinking one dance would be sufficient to make the point," she said. "One dance," he said slowly, as though he were testing the weight of it, "would not be enough." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. If your aim is to silence talk," he said, "one dance is a curiosity. People will say it was polite, nothing more. If you want to change the story they are telling about you, you need more than one dance." He met her eyes fully. "I am suggesting that if you want this to work, I should escort you the whole evening. Every dance you choose to have, you have with me. That is the kind of thing people remember and talk about differently." Emma Bailey felt something shift inside her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. It was not alarm, exactly. It was something adjacent to the feeling she got when a good horse decided to trust her, a shift of weight and attention that meant something real was happening. "You have thought about this quickly," she said. "It is not complicated to think about." She looked at him for another moment. Behind her she could hear the room holding its breath. "All right," she said. "I agree." His mouth moved then properly into something that was almost a smile but carried more warmth than the word smile usually suggested. "Good," he said. "I will come by for you at 7 in the evening. You can tell me which ranch is yours on my way out of town." "Bailey Ranch is the one with the white gate post on the east road," she said. "You cannot miss it. My father painted it years ago, and it has stayed white through stubbornness alone." "White gate post," he repeated. "I will find it." Emma finished her lemonade, set the glass on the bar with a nod to Gus, and walked back through the silver spur and out the front door into the evening air, and did not look at Franklin Holt or Jeb Morrison or any of the other 15 men who had witnessed the whole exchange. She was halfway down the boardwalk before she realized her hands had stopped trembling. The next 2 weeks were more eventful than she had bargained for. The story was through the town by Saturday morning, because Jeb Morrison worked fast, and because there was nothing the people of Dusty Creek liked better than a new development in an ongoing story. Emma heard about it indirectly, through Pete Grady, who heard it at the feed store, that the general opinion was divided between those who thought Emma Bailey had gone and made herself look even more shameless by walking into a saloon to ask a man to take her dancing, and those who found the whole thing either admirable or at least entertaining enough to reserve judgment. Franklin Holt had apparently been heard to say that Mercer didn't know what he was getting into, which was the kind of thing a man said when he was embarrassed and wanted to not be alone in it. What Emma had not counted on was that Dexter Mercer would come by the ranch on the Monday, following their conversation, with a legitimate reason for the visit. She was in the yard working on the fence around her vegetable garden, because the rabbits had decided winter was over and so had their interest in her early beans, when she heard a horse on the east road, and looked up to see a bay horse with a tall rider in a brown hat turning in through her white gate post. She straightened and wiped her hands on her work apron and waited. He pulled up and dismounted in the easy way of someone who had spent a large portion of his life getting on and off horses. He took off his hat and held it, which she noted. "Miss Bailey," he said, "Mr. Mercer, this is a surprise. I hope not an unwelcome one. I came because I have a business question if you have a moment." She gestured toward the porch. "Come and sit." They sat in the 2 chairs on her porch, and he explained that he was planning to expand the Weston spread and was looking to understand the water rights situation on the eastern side of the territory, which was something her father had navigated and which Emma knew better than most people realized. She told him about the creek that ran through the lower pasture, which was technically on the Bailey land but had historically been shared with reasonable goodwill between the neighboring spreads, and about the agreement her father had made with the Weston family 20 years prior that was verbal rather than written, which was the kind of thing that caused problems eventually. He listened carefully. He asked specific, intelligent questions. He did not talk over her or redirect her to a man's opinion, and by the end of the conversation, she had revised her impression of him upward from simply interesting to genuinely worth knowing. When they had finished the business, he did not immediately leave. He sat for a moment looking out at her property with the considering gaze she had already begun to recognize. "You run this place yourself?" he asked. "Pete Grady works for me, but yes, primarily." "Your south fence line needs new posts," he said. "3 of them from what I can see from here." "I know," she said. "I am getting to it. I have extra posts from my own fencing work. I could bring them by." She looked at him carefully. "That would be charity. It would be a neighborly exchange. You just told me more about the water rights in this area than I could have found out in 6 months of asking around. That is worth 3 fence posts." She considered this with the same careful attention she gave to any proposition that sounded too convenient, but his face was straightforward and he was not watching her with the particular expression men sometimes wore when they were doing something they expected to be thanked for extensively. He looked like a man making a reasonable offer. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, put his hat back on and stood. "I will bring them Thursday. And I will see you at the dance a week from Saturday." "You will," she said. He rode back out through the white gate post, and Emma sat on her porch for a while after the dust had settled, thinking about the kind of man who came to ask about water rights and noticed your fence posts, and offered something useful without requiring gratitude in return. He brought the posts on Thursday, as promised, with a roll of wire and the casual offer to help set them, which she accepted because she was practical, and 3 fence posts went in faster with 2 people. They worked in the warm afternoon, him digging and her holding, and the conversation they had across the work was the kind that jumped from one topic to another without calculation, from the state of the land to the condition of the cattle market, to a book he had apparently read during the winter that he described with an enthusiasm that surprised her pleasantly. a collection of natural history observations by a man named Burroughs that had been published a few years prior. "You read," she said, without meaning to make it sound remarkable. "I do," he said, tamping down the earth around the post. "It was a long winter. What else have you read?" He listed things, and she responded with her own list, which she had built over years of ordering from the catalog and trading with Clara Watkins, who had a similar habit. The last post went in, and they stood looking at the fence line in the fading afternoon, and she felt the particular satisfaction of work completed and conversation that had not exhausted her the way most conversations in Dusty Creek had a tendency to do. "I should get back before dark," he said. "Of course." He gathered his tools and she walked with him to his horse, and at the gate he paused and looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "I am looking forward to the dance, Miss Bailey." "As am I," she said, and found that she meant it in a way she had not anticipated when she had walked into the Silver Spur 10 days ago with shaking hands and a plan. The night of the Founders' Dance arrived with the kind of warm spring evening that felt like a promise. The air smelled of grass and distant rain and the wild sage that grew along the creek banks, and the stars were beginning to show themselves in a sky that had gone from gold to lavender to the deep blue that preceded full dark. Emma had dressed with more care than usual, not because she was trying to be noticed exactly, but because she had decided that if this evening was going to matter, it ought to look like it mattered. She wore her blue dress, the one with the small pearl buttons at the collar and the way it moved when she walked that had always pleased her, and she put her hair up properly with the tortoiseshell pins her mother had left her, and she looked in the small mirror above her washstand and found herself acceptable, which was a good deal more than she usually settled for. At 5 minutes past 7, she heard a horse on the east road. She stepped out onto the porch and watched Dexter Mercer come through the white gate post in the golden last light of day, and she noted that he had made his own efforts. His shirt was white and pressed, and his hat was his good one, which she had not yet seen but could identify as the good one by the way he wore it. He had shaved carefully. He looked, she thought, like a man who understood that some evenings were occasions. He tied his horse and came up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Miss Bailey," he said, and the way he said it carried something different from the other times he had said her name, something that recognized the occasion and her place in it. "Mr. Mercer, you are punctual. I find it respectful to be on time when a woman has gone to some trouble," he said, and his eyes moved over her quickly and returned to her face with an expression she filed away to think about later. They walked the 3/4 of a mile into town together in the warm evening, and the walk itself was easier than she expected. He asked about Pete Grady and whether the south fence was holding, and she asked about his cattle, and by the time the lights of town were showing ahead, she realized she had forgotten to be nervous. The barn behind the church was transformed, the way it always was this one night of the year. Lanterns hung from the rafters and along the rails, throwing warm, moving light over the swept floor, and the long tables set with punch bowls and plates of food brought by every family in town. Old Clarence was already playing something lively in the corner, his white hair catching the light and his boot keeping time on the floorboards, and the sound of it spilled out through the open barn doors and made the evening feel generous. They walked in together, and Emma felt the room shift. It was the same shift that happened in the Silver Spur, that particular adjustment of attention when something unexpected appears, but this time it was bigger because there were more people, and because this was the Founders' Dance, which was the most social event the town produced all year. She saw Mrs. Caldwell near the punch table stop mid-sentence. She saw Franklin Holt across the room with his jaw set. She saw Reverend Hatch's wife lean toward her husband with her hand over her mouth. She saw Clara Watkins, who was standing near the door, catch Emma's eye and give her a look of pure, bright satisfaction. She also felt Dexter Mercer's hand settle at the small of her back as they moved into the room, light and confident, a gesture of accompaniment rather than possession, and she stood a little straighter because of it. They went to the punch table first, because one had to start somewhere, and Gus from the Silver Spur, who was also helping pour at the dance because he was the most experienced drink pourer in town, handed them both cups with the same professional neutrality he had offered in the saloon, which Emma appreciated. The first song old Clarence moved into was a waltz, something slow enough to hear your own heartbeat through, and Dexter Mercer set down his punch cup and turned to her and offered his hand. "I believe this is our first of several," he said. "Several," she agreed and took his hand. He could dance. She had not been certain of this, though Clara's fence post theory had given her some optimism, but the evidence was immediate and undeniable. He danced the way he did most things, with quiet competence and no desire to show off, keeping the steps clean and the hold proper, which was a relief, and looking at her instead of at the room, which was something she had not expected and which required a small, private adjustment. "You can dance," she said, after they had made one circuit of the floor. "My mother was a firm believer in it," he said. "She taught all 4 of her children, and she was not gentle about it." "4 children. Are you the oldest?" "Second oldest. I have a brother who would rather be thrown from a horse than dance, and he managed to escape her lessons, which I have not yet forgiven him for." She laughed. It came out naturally, without the self-consciousness she usually felt when she laughed in public, as though whatever protective layer she normally kept in place had not come with her to the dance. "Do you see your family?" she asked. "My mother passed 8 years ago. My father and oldest brother are in San Antonio. The youngest is in New Mexico territory. We write. I am sorry about your mother. She was a remarkable woman," he said, simply and without performance. "I think she would have found you interesting." Emma looked at him. "That is an unusual thing to say. I mean it as a compliment." "I know," she said. "That is why it is unusual." The waltz ended and old Clarence moved into something faster, a reel that had the younger members of the crowd whooping, and they danced that too, and the one after, and somewhere in the middle of the third song Emma stopped thinking about who was watching and started simply dancing. The lanterns moved overhead, the fiddle sang, and Dexter Mercer's hand was steady in hers, and she thought, without really meaning to think it, "This is what I have been missing." They paused for more punch between songs, and that was when Franklin Holt materialized at Emma's elbow with the particular expression of a man who has worked himself up to saying something and does not intend to be talked out of it. "Emma," he said. "Franklin," she said. He was 30, fair-haired and broad, with the look of a man who had spent his whole life being told he was going to have things and had believed it. He glanced at Dexter Mercer with something between assessment and dismissal. "I wonder if I might have a dance," he said to Emma. "I'm afraid my dance card is full this evening," Emma said pleasantly. Franklin's jaw tightened. "I see." He turned his gaze more deliberately to Dexter. "You are the man who bought the Weston spread." "I am," Dexter said, with the same uncomplicated steadiness he brought to everything. "Good operation there if you know what you are doing with it." "I believe I do." There was a moment between the two men that Emma recognized as the kind of exchange that happened without words, a taking of each other's measure, and then Franklin Holt gave a brief nod that was not quite gracious, but was not hostile either, and turned and walked back across the barn. Emma watched him go and felt some knot that had been present in her chest for several months loosen a single turn. Old Clarence began something new, slower again, and Dexter Mercer turned to her and offered his hand without a word, and she took it without a word, and they moved back onto the floor. "That was handled well," she said quietly. "It required no particular handling," he said. "He proposed to me last October," she said, because she found she wanted him to know. "I turned him down. I gathered something like that from the way he said your name." "And?" she asked. "And nothing," he said. "It is not my business, and whatever your reasons, I expect they were good ones." She looked up at him. He was looking at her in that steady, attentive way of his, and she thought about what Clara had said, that he was a man who ironed his shirts even when there was no occasion, and she understood now what Clara had been gesturing toward. He was a man who paid attention to things because he believed they were worth paying attention to, not because he was performing care, but because he actually had it. They danced through the evening. They ate from the long tables and talked with Clara Watkins and her husband Bill, who were good people in good company, and Dexter made easy conversation with Bill about cattle prices, which Emma listened to and occasionally joined. And Clara caught Emma's eye twice across the table with an expression that said everything she was too polite to say out loud. Around 9 in the evening, when the air in the barn had grown warm and the crowd had thinned slightly as families with young children made their way home, old Clarence played something that was not quite a waltz and not quite anything else, just a slow, sweet, wandering melody that felt like something remembered from long ago. Most of the remaining couples drifted onto the floor. The lantern light had mellowed as the evening went on, and the barn felt intimate in a way it had not in the earlier, louder hours. Dexter Mercer turned to her and held out his hand for what must have been the 7th or 8th time that evening, and she took it, and this time when they moved together on the floor something was different. Not in anything that could be pointed at, but the distance between them that had been respectful and proper had become something that was still respectful and proper, but also felt like it was exactly where she wanted to be, and she was aware of his hand at her back and his hand holding hers with a warmth that was not just warmth in the temperature sense but in the other sense, the one she did not have a clean word for. "You were right," she said quietly. "About what?" One dance would not have been enough. He looked at her. The lamplight caught the gray of his eyes and made them something else entirely. "No," he said, "it would not have. I am glad you said so, in the saloon when I asked." "So am I," he said. They danced the rest of that song without talking, and Emma thought about how strange it was that she had walked into the Silver Spur 11 days ago with a practical plan, and had somehow ended up here, in the middle of a barn full of lantern light, feeling something she had not felt in so long she had nearly forgotten it was something people felt. The following weeks were a transformation. Not in the way Emma had planned exactly, though the plan part worked. The gossip did shift, because the sight of Emma Bailey at the Founders' dance in the company of Dexter Mercer, dancing every dance and laughing and looking like a woman who belonged exactly where she was not something Dusty Creek could dismiss easily. Mrs. Caldwell's comments became a degree warmer. The tight smiles became less tight. Reverend Hatch's wife stopped pointedly ignoring Emma at church, and replaced it with a somewhat grudging civility. It was not a transformation in the town's character. Emma was too clear-eyed about people to expect that, but it was a shift in temperature, and in Dusty Creek's dry, close air, a shift in temperature mattered. But the transformation she had not planned for was the one happening in her own chest. Dexter Mercer came by the ranch on the Wednesday after the dance. He had a legitimate reason again, a question about the shared creek, and whether Emma had seen the water level dropping on her side, which she had, and which indicated something upstream might need attention. They walked the creek line together in the warm afternoon, and found a partial blockage where brush had accumulated over the winter, and spent the better part of an hour clearing it, working side by side with the comfortable ease that she was beginning to notice they had together, the kind of ease that most people built over years, and which seemed to have arrived between them without the years. He came back the following Saturday to look at the blockage, and confirm the water was flowing properly. He stayed for supper, because she offered, and because it seemed a natural extension of the afternoon, and she made a simple meal and they ate at her kitchen table and talked until the lamp needed refilling, at which point he said he should get back and they walked out to his horse together in the dark, and she stood at her white gate post and watched him ride north and felt, with a clarity she recognized from important moments in her life, that she was in considerable trouble. The trouble was that she did not experience it as trouble. That was the particular difficulty of the situation. She told Clara about it on a Sunday afternoon when Clara came by with more dried beans and the excellent excuse of wanting to check on the south fence. They sat on the porch in the warm afternoon, and Emma said, carefully, that she thought she might be developing feelings for Dexter Mercer that went beyond the practical arrangement they had started with. Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman who had known this was coming. "Of course you are," Clara said. "That was not the plan." "Plans rarely survive contact with a good man," Clara said. "Does he know? No. Does he feel the same?" Emma thought about the way he looked at her, the steadiness of his attention. The way he had said in the barn that one dance would not be enough, and the way he had said it not as a practical strategy but as something else. "I think," she said slowly, "he might." "Then what is the problem?" "The problem," Emma said, "is that the last time I trusted what I thought I felt, it was about a man who I later discovered was very good at performing feelings without having them, and I spent 2 years building something on that and then watching it come to nothing. I am cautious." Clara nodded. She knew the story or enough of it. A man Emma had known before her father died, who had courted her with genuine apparent ardor and then revealed when circumstances changed, that his ardor had been attached to the Bailey land more than to Emma herself. It had not broken her, but it had made her careful in the particular way that only getting something wrong once makes you careful. "Dexter Mercer is not that man," Clara said. "I know," Emma said. "That is not the concern. The concern is my own judgment." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have excellent judgment, Emma, you always have. The problem in that other situation was not your judgment. It was that you were given deliberately false information and you responded to what you had been given. That is not the same as poor judgment. It is just being betrayed by someone who chose to lie." Emma sat with that for a long time, listening to the wind move through the grass and the distant sound of the creek doing its business. "He is coming by Tuesday," she said finally. "He mentioned he wanted to see the eastern pasture to understand where the property lines fell." "That sounds like a man who finds reasons to come by," Clara said. Emma smiled. "It does, doesn't it?" Tuesday arrived, and Dexter came, and they walked the eastern pasture in the morning light, and he asked careful questions about the property lines, which she answered. And then they talked about everything else, and she paid attention to him the way she always did and found nothing that alarmed her and a great deal that did the opposite. At the edge of the eastern pasture, where the grass gave way to a cluster of live oak trees along the creek bank, they stopped because the view from there was genuinely beautiful, the water catching the morning light and the hills beyond the town going blue in the distance. And Emma said, "My father used to say this was the best view in the county." "He was right," Dexter said. He was looking at the view but briefly and then looking at her, and she caught it. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Bailey," he said. "We have been meeting fairly regularly for several weeks now." "We have," he agreed. "Is that," she said and paused and made herself continue, "intentional on your part?" He turned toward her fully. There was no performance in his expression. It was the same direct, attentive look he had given her in the Silver Spur the first evening, the look that had made her trust him enough to say all right. "Yes," he said simply. She breathed. "I see. I hope that is not unwelcome." "It is not," she said. "Good," he said, and then after a moment, "I would like to court you properly if you are amenable. Not just walk fence lines and discuss water rights, though I am happy to continue doing both." She looked at him. The live oak trees moved in the slight wind and the creek talked over its stones and the world felt very still and very clear. "I am amenable," she said. It was the simplest, most honest conversation she had ever had about something of this magnitude, and she was grateful for that, because she had discovered in her 24 years that simplicity and honesty were the two ingredients most frequently left out of the conversations that mattered most, and their absence was usually where things went wrong. They started formally, in the way that was proper and the way that also happened to suit them both, which was to say that he came by in the evenings, or she came to town and they walked together and they talked. They talked about everything. About the land and the work, which was the backbone of both their lives, but also about bigger things. What they believed, what they wanted, what they were afraid of, what had shaped them into the particular people they had become. He told her about growing up in San Antonio, the second son of a man who had built a cattle operation from nothing and who had given all four of his children a fierce independent streak and the ability to read the weather. She told him about growing up in Dusty Creek with a father who had read to her every evening and a mother who had died when Emma was 16, and whose absence was still a shape in her life, a permanent outline of something that had been there. He listened the way good listeners listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what she said and responding to it, and she did the same for him. And the result was that they knew each other with a speed and depth that might have seemed too fast if it had not felt entirely earned. The town watched all of this with the interest it brought to everything. Mrs. Caldwell had apparently revised her opinion of Emma considerably, or at least had revised her public expression of it, because she now greeted Emma with actual warmth at the Mercantile and had stopped giving her slow service. Franklin Holt had been seen to nod at Dexter Mercer on the street with something approaching genuine respect, or at least a reasonable imitation of it, and had apparently told someone at the feed store that the Weston property was in good hands, which was the closest thing to a blessing he was likely to offer. Jeb Morrison at the telegraph office had a whole new story to tell and seemed considerably pleased about it. Reverend Hatch came to call at Emma's ranch in late May, which surprised her until he explained that he wanted to discuss the annual church fundraiser and whether she might be willing to donate some of her produce from the summer harvest, and then stayed for a cup of coffee and said, with a directness that his wife probably would not have approved of, that he was glad to see Emma happy, and that he hoped she knew the congregation valued her presence even if they had not always been as good at showing it. Emma thanked him for saying so, and did not say everything she might have said about the congregation's previous behavior, because she was a practical woman and bridges that had been set alight were better rebuilt than discussed. Dexter had dinner at her kitchen table so regularly by June that Pete Grady had taken to setting 3 plates without being asked, which was the kind of silent, practical endorsement that meant more to Emma than any formal statement could have. In June, when the summer heat settled over the land like a hand pressing down, a matter came up that tested everyone's composure. The water rights situation that Emma and Dexter had discussed in February had grown complicated. A rancher named Curtis Webb, who had bought some land to the northwest the previous year, and who Emma had quietly suspected, was not a man of good faith based on 1 or 2 interactions at the feed store, had begun diverting water from a tributary that fed into the shared creek. It was not a dramatic act of villainy, exactly, but it was the kind of slow, quiet taking that accumulated into real damage, and by the end of May, Emma was seeing reduced water levels on the eastern pasture that affected her cattle. She brought it to Dexter on a Wednesday evening when he came for dinner, laying out what she had observed with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything practical, and he listened carefully and then said he had been watching the same thing from his northern pasture. "We could go to the land office," she said. "We could," he said, "but the water rights in this area are not fully documented, which is exactly what Webb is counting on. He is betting that ambiguity works in his favor." "Then we document it," Emma said. They spent the next week doing exactly that. Emma had her father's journals, which included careful observations about water flow and usage on the Bailey land going back 20 years, and Dexter tracked down the records from the Weston ownership. And together, they assembled a record of historical water use that was compelling if not legally perfect. They also spoke to several older ranchers in the area who remembered the water arrangements from before documentation was common, and who were willing to say so to the land office. It took 3 weeks and 2 trips to the county seat, where Emma sat in a small wooden office and presented their documentation to a land agent, who initially addressed all his questions to Dexter, and who gradually, under the pressure of Emma's clear and detailed answers, redirected them toward her. By the end of the second meeting, He was treating her as the primary source of information she actually was, and the water rights in the area were formally clarified in a way that made Webb's diversion not just problematic but clearly unlawful. Curtis Webb received a formal notice and stopped the diversion within the week. He was not gracious about it, but he stopped. Emma and Dexter rode back from the county seat on the second return trip in the warm late afternoon, side by side on the road through the grass, and she was aware of a feeling she wanted to identify precisely. It was not just relief that the water situation was resolved, though that was present. It was the feeling of having done a difficult thing alongside someone who had carried exactly half the weight without either taking too much or making her feel she had not carried enough. It was the feeling of partnership, which was a word she had always understood intellectually but which she now felt the full weight of. "Thank you," she said, when they were a mile from Dusty Creek. "You did the harder part," he said. "I did not." "You did. You walked into that office and you made a man who had decided to look past you look at you instead, and you were clear and patient and right, and that takes more than what I did." She looked at him. The evening light came across his face at an angle that made his gray eyes warmer than their usual color. "I want to say something," she said. "Then say it." "I am not good at this," she said. "At this particular kind of saying. I am good at most kinds of talking, as you may have noticed, but this specific kind is one I have avoided for reasons that seemed sensible at the time." He waited. "I care about you," she said. "More than I planned to when I walked into the Silver Spur that April evening with a plan and my hands shaking. And I wanted to say it plainly because I think plainly is the right way, and also because you have been saying it in every way that is not words for 2 months now, and I did not want to be the person who received all of that and never gave anything back." He stopped his horse. She pulled hers up and looked at him. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. Not in the quiet, reserved, steady way she had come to know, but something more open, something that was, she thought, what he looked like when he was not managing anything. "Emma," he said, and the way he said her name this time was entirely different from every other time he had said it. "Yes," she said. "I have been in love with you since approximately the evening you walked into the Silver Spur and asked me to escort you to the Founder's Dance with your chin up and your hands shaking and your voice completely steady." She stared at him. "You could see my hands shaking. I was standing right next to you. I thought I had hidden that." "You had hidden it from everyone else in the room," he said. "I was paying particular attention." She felt something expand in her chest, slow and warm and very large. "That is either very observant or very presumptuous," she said. "I prefer to think of it as very attentive," he said. "Dexter," she said, and the first use of his given name between them landed in the air like something significant, which it was. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. "I should have said it before now, but I was being careful, and I think careful has had long enough." He smiled. Properly, fully, in a way she had not seen him smile yet, and it changed his face into something she wanted to look at for a very long time. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, the way he had in the barn on the first dance, light and confident and warm. "I intend to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not right now, on a dusty road between the county seat and Dusty Creek with both of us covered in a day's worth of travel, but soon. I wanted you to know that so you are not surprised." "I appreciate the advance warning," she said. "I thought you would." They rode the last mile into Dusty Creek hand in hand where the road was wide enough for it, and Emma thought about the word soon and found she could not wait for it. He asked her on a Sunday morning in July, at the edge of the eastern pasture where the live oak trees grew along the creek, and where she had told him about her father's favorite view. He did not make it elaborate. He came in the morning with his hat in his hands, and she met him at the white gate post, and they walked to the creek together. And when they stood beneath the live oaks with the water running clear over the stones and the summer sky enormous overhead, he turned to her and said what he had come to say. He did not have a ring, not yet, because the jeweler in the county seat who had the kind of ring he had in mind needed 2 weeks to size it properly. But he described it to her, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he thought matched something about her, though he could not have said exactly what. "Yes," she said, before he had quite finished describing the ring. "I haven't quite." "Yes," she said again. He laughed, the full, unguarded laugh she had heard a handful of times now and which remained one of her favorite sounds in the world. He put his hat on and stepped toward her and put his hands on her face and kissed her for the first time, warm and careful and then less careful. And the creek ran on over its stones, and the live oaks moved above them, and everything felt entirely right. They told Pete Grady first, because he was standing in the yard when they came back, and because he was family in the way that mattered. He shook Dexter's hand with his own large, calloused one and said gruffly that it was about time, and then turned back to his work, which was the most expressive Pete ever got and which Emma recognized as full-throated approval. They told Clara Watkins on Sunday afternoon, and Clara cried, briefly and with complete lack of embarrassment, and hugged Emma hard and then hugged Dexter, who accepted the hug with good grace. And then Bill Watkins shook Dexter's hand and said welcome to the continued madness of caring about this particular stubborn woman, which was a joke, but also not entirely a joke, and which Dexter received with the smile that meant he understood both parts. The announcement was made through the natural mechanism of Dusty Creek itself, which was to say that by Monday morning the town knew, and by Monday afternoon the conversation at the Silver Spur was apparently considerable. Gus sent Emma a very fine bottle of lemonade extract through Pete Grady, which was the most touching wedding gift she received because of its unexpectedness. They married in September of 1883, in the church with the crooked steeple, on a Saturday when the heat of summer had finally released its grip, and the air carried the first suggestion of autumn. Reverend Hatch officiated with considerably more warmth than Emma had expected, and she thought that perhaps he was a better man than his wife's behavior had led her to believe, or perhaps he was simply a man who got better at the edges of his nature when occasion required it. Emma wore her mother's dress, which had been in a cedar chest in the back bedroom since 1867, and which Clara had spent 3 weeks carefully altering and cleaning until it was perfect. It was ivory silk with small glass buttons and a skirt that moved when Emma walked in a way that made her feel, for a moment, like her mother was there. Dexter stood at the front of the church in a dark suit he had apparently ridden to San Antonio to have made, because he had quietly gone to San Antonio for a week in August and returned with the suit and the turquoise ring, which fit exactly right when he put it on her hand in the church with the whole of Dusty Creek watching, including Mrs. Caldwell in the third row who was visibly moved, and Clara Watkins, who was not even attempting to manage her tears, and Franklin Holt near the back, who wore the expression of a man who had understood something about himself that he would not have wanted to articulate. When Reverend Hatch said the words and Dexter said "I do" and Emma said "I do," Emma felt not the dramatic bolt she had imagined when she was younger that love and marriage would feel like, but something better, a deep, steady rightness, like a fence post going into good solid earth, the kind of thing that would hold. After the ceremony, the whole town moved to the barn behind the church, because apparently that was what Dusty Creek did with its significant occasions, and old Clarence was there with his fiddle, and there was food and punch and the warm autumn light coming through the open doors, and Emma danced. She danced with her husband first, in the way that a dance between two people who know each other can be, full of the small private language that accumulates between people who pay close attention to each other. And she thought about the Founders' Dance in April, and how she had walked in with a plan and shaking hands, and had danced with this man for the first time thinking it would silence the gossip, and how the gossip had turned out to be the least interesting thing that had happened that evening. She danced with Bill Watkins, who was a terrible dancer but an enthusiastic one, and with Pete Grady, who turned out to be surprisingly light on his feet for a man who spent his days doing fence work. She danced with Clara, because there was a brief reel that demanded pairs and Dexter gallantly stepped aside and took Clara's husband, and Emma danced with her best friend in the lamplight and felt her own happiness so sharply it was almost an ache. And then old Clarence played that same slow, wandering melody he had played at the Founder's dance, the not-quite waltz that felt like a memory, and Dexter found her and led her back to the floor, and she went with the ease of a woman going somewhere she already knew, and they danced it together the same way they had danced it in April, except that now he was her husband and she was his wife, and the distance that had been proper and respectful was now simply the right distance, the one that felt like home. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, his mouth near her hair. "Remarkably," she said. "Good," he said. "I intend to keep it that way." She believed him. The years that followed were the years Emma had not quite let herself imagine when she was running the Bailey Ranch alone and enduring the town's slow, grinding judgment. They were not simple years, because life in Dusty Creek in the 1880s was not simple, and the land demanded everything, and the weather was inconsistent, and the cattle market moved in ways that required constant adjustment. But they were good years, full of the texture that good years have. They combined the two properties in the practical way, keeping the Bailey land in Emma's name, which Dexter had insisted on and which mattered to her more than she could easily express, and working the two operations as one under the name Mercer Bailey, which caused some comment at the county office and no comment from either of them, because they had decided together that it was the right name, and that was the end of it. Pete Grady stayed on, because he was part of the land the way the fence posts were, and over the years he became something like an uncle to the family they built, present and useful and occasionally opinionated in the way that only earned relationships can be. In the spring of 1885, their first child was born, a boy, which the doctor announced, and which Dexter received with the expression Emma had learned to read as joy that he was keeping a careful hold on. They named him Joseph, after Emma's father, which Dexter had suggested before she had worked up to asking, which was one of the countless small moments in their marriage when he demonstrated that he paid attention to the things that mattered to her. Joseph Bailey Mercer grew up with the ranch as his world, and with parents who talked to him plainly and read to him every evening, and taught him to respect the land and the water and the people who worked it. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's direct way of speaking and a laugh that was entirely his own. In 1887, a daughter arrived, whom they named Rose, after Dexter's mother, and who from her first weeks demonstrated a temperament that combined Dexter's steadiness with Emma's determination in a way that suggested interesting things about her future. She was fierce and patient in equal measure, and she learned to ride before she learned to read, which Emma tried to present to Reverend Hatch's wife as a reasonable sequence of events when the subject arose at a church social. The house on the eastern edge of town, Emma's childhood home, was expanded over the years, carefully and at the pace of what they could afford, because they were not people who borrowed against the future. A new room off the back for when Clara and Bill's children came to visit, which was frequent and which was loud, and which Emma loved completely. A wider porch because she had always believed in porches. A second cook stove that Dexter had shipped from San Antonio for her birthday in 1886, and which changed cooking for the whole household in ways that still pleased her every time she used it. The Bailey Ranch's white gate post, the one her father had painted years ago and which had stayed white through stubbornness alone, was repainted by Dexter in the summer of 1884, because it had finally begun to gray, and because he had noticed, and because that was what he did. He painted it white and clean, and Emma stood at the fence watching him do it and felt, quietly and privately and completely, that she was living the right life. Dusty Creek itself changed in the years following Emma and Dexter's marriage, in the slow, incremental ways that towns changed. The telegraph office expanded, and Jeb Morrison hired a young woman as an assistant, which was remarked upon and which became unremarkable within a year. The Silver Spur got new floors and Gus hired a second barman and started keeping lemonade available on a regular basis rather than as a special offering, which Emma chose to regard as an indirect tribute. The school added a second teacher when the town grew enough to need one, and the doctor's office moved to a larger building, and the cattle market stayed unpredictable, but the land stayed generous to the people who worked it with care. Mrs. Caldwell retired the mercantile in 1889, and her nephew took it over, a young man who had no preformed opinions about anyone and who treated every customer with straightforward commercial courtesy. Emma had a conversation with Mrs. Caldwell at that time, at a church social, which was brief, and which both of them navigated with the careful honesty of women who know they have not always been generous to each other, and are old enough to acknowledge it without making it large. Mrs. Caldwell said she had been unkind in certain past years and that she was sorry for it, and Emma said she accepted the apology, and that was that. It was a small thing and a complete thing. Franklin Holt married in 1886, a woman from a family near Amarillo who had, by all accounts, more than enough strength of character to manage him, and Emma wished him well genuinely, because she had long since ceased to care about Franklin Holt in any direction, which was the correct relationship to have with him. Old Clarence kept playing at every dance and every occasion until 1891, when his hands began to trouble him, and he taught everything he knew to a young Mexican man, named Tomás, who had come to Dusty Creek with a family of seasonal workers, and had stayed because Dusty Creek needed a fiddle player and Tomás needed a place, and the town was better for the exchange on both counts. Emma had been particularly vocal in supporting Tomás's welcome in Dusty Creek when certain voices had suggested otherwise, because she had learned from the water rights business, and from the slow, persistent injustice of people deciding who belonged, and who did not. That silence in those moments was its own kind of wrong. Dexter had stood beside her in all of it, in the way he stood beside her in everything, present and steady, and adding his voice where it carried weight and stepping back where hers carried more. On a September evening in 1893, exactly 10 years after their wedding day, they sat on the wide porch of the expanded ranch house in the warm last light of a day that had been good, the kind that you noticed as you lived it rather than only in retrospect. The land around them was gold and green, the creek busy in the distance, the cattle settled in the pasture, the live oak trees along the eastern edge moving in a slight wind. Joseph was 8 and had spent the day following Pete Grady through the south pasture, with the devoted efficiency of a boy who had decided he was already a working rancher. He was asleep now, hard and complete, the way children slept when they had spent the day in the sun. Rose was 6 and had been more interested in the books Emma had set out for her than in following Pete, which Emma privately found encouraging, and which Dexter said meant she had her mother's mind, which he said as if it were the most fortunate thing imaginable. They sat together in the evening, Dexter's arm around Emma's shoulders in the comfortable way of 10 years of easy proximity, watching the light change on the hills. 10 years, Emma said. 10 years, he agreed. When I walked into the Silver Spur that evening, she said, I had a plan to silence the town's gossip and I expected it to take one dance. And I told you one would not be enough. And I agreed, she said, though I did not know what I was agreeing to. Neither did I fully, he said. I thought I was agreeing to an interesting evening. And I got this, he said. He meant the ranch and the children and the porch and the 10 years and all of it. She could hear all of it in the one word. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the land she had been born on and had nearly broken trying to hold and had kept, and which was now something more than kept. It was alive and growing and full of the future that she and this man had made together. Dexter, she said. Emma, he said. I would do it again, she said. Every part of it, from the Silver Spur to right now. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, brief and warm and entirely certain. So would I, he said. Every single step. The stars were beginning to show themselves in the darkening sky, the same stars that had been above Dusty Creek for all of recorded memory. indifferent to gossip and planning, and the small strategic calculations people made in the face of other people's opinions. They were out there every night over the Bailey Ranch and the Weston property and the live oak trees and the creek and all of it, and they would be there tomorrow night, and the night after that. Rose appeared at the front door in her nightgown with her hair down around her shoulders and her expression indicating that she was not particularly tired and would like company on the porch. "Bed," Emma said. "I am not tired," Rose said. "That is what everyone who is tired says," Emma said. Rose considered this with the particular 6-year-old seriousness she brought to arguments she suspected she was losing. Then she looked at her father. Dexter said, "Come here, then." She came and climbed into his lap, which she was getting slightly too large for but which she managed by determination, and settled against his chest with the satisfied air of someone who had won a negotiation. He pulled his arm from around Emma's shoulders to put it around Rose instead, and Emma reached over and covered both their hands with hers. They sat like that in the deepening evening until Rose's breathing slowed and her head dropped, and Dexter looked at Emma over their sleeping daughter's hair with an expression she had catalogued over 10 years and which still, every single time, caught her somewhere warm. "I love you," he said quietly. "I love you," she said. Around them, the land of West Texas went on doing what it had always done, holding water and grass and cattle, and the lives of stubborn, careful people who had chosen to make their homes in its particular beauty. The town of Dusty Creek went on the way towns did, shifting and growing and talking, and occasionally managing to do right by people when it tried hard enough. The white gate post at the entrance to the Mercer Bailey ranch stood as it had always stood since Joseph Bailey had painted it years ago, and his daughter had noted it to a stranger in a saloon as a landmark. And it was white and straight and solid in the earth, the kind of thing that held because the right people had given it proper attention and believed it was worth holding. Inside the house, in the cedar chest in the back bedroom, alongside Emma's mother's ivory dress, and the receipts from the county seat's water rights proceedings, and the small collection of books that had grown considerably over 10 years, was a copy of old Clarence's fiddle tune, written out by Tamaz in the careful notation he had learned, the wandering melody that was not quite a waltz and not quite anything else. The song that had played at the Founders' Dance in April of 1883, and that had played again at Emma and Dexter's wedding in September of that same year, and which old Clarence had called, when asked, simply the one that worked, by which he meant the one that made people want to move together on the floor, the one that made the evening feel like it was going somewhere true. Joseph Mercer woke early the next morning the way he always did, with the dawn and the birds and the cattle's first sounds from the pasture, and came downstairs to find his father already at the kitchen table with coffee and his mother already out in the yard checking the south fence. And he ate his breakfast and pulled on his boots and went to find Pete Grady, because there was always work and he always wanted to be doing it. Pete Grady was at the barn, mending a bridle with the patience that characterized everything he did, and he looked up when Joseph appeared and said, "South pasture needs checking," which was what he always said, and Joseph said, "I know," which was what he always said, and they went off together across the golden morning land. Emma came back in from the fence and found Dexter at the stove adding to his coffee, and she went and stood next to him, and he put his arm around her in the easy morning way, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the bread she had put on the night before that Rose would want when she woke up, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. On the hillside east of town, where the Bailey land met the open sky, the live oaks were fully leafed in late summer green, and the creek ran low but steady over its stones, the same creek that had run low in the drought year of 1886 and high in the flood year of 1890, and somewhere in between in all the years on either side. The same creek that Emma had watched her father study when she was a child, learning that land was not just dirt but relationship, that you had to understand it to deserve it. She understood it now, all of it, the land and the water and the work and the relationship, and she stood in it like something rooted, like something that had chosen its ground and intended to keep it. In the town, the morning was beginning its ordinary business. Gus was opening the silver spur to clean it before the day's customers arrived. Tamaz was tuning his fiddle in the small house on the south side where he now lived with his wife and young son. Clara Watkins was opening the laundry, where the line of work she had built over many years continued its steady, practical good. Jeb Morrison had a new story to tell and would tell it all day. Reverend Hatch was writing his Sunday sermon and trying to make it better than last week's, which was his ongoing project. And Emma Mercer, who had been Emma Bailey, who had been the woman the town thought it knew what to do with, stood in her kitchen with her husband's arm around her and her daughter still sleeping upstairs and her son already in the pasture, learning the work he loved, and she was happy. Not in the thin, provisional way of someone who was happy in spite of circumstances, but in the full, earned way of someone who had taken a night in April when everything had felt impossible, and a plan that had seemed like a small tactical decision, and had followed it all the way to this, to 10 years and 2 children and a ranch with a white gate post, and a man with gray eyes who had told her, the first night they spoke, that one would not be enough. She had agreed then, without knowing what she was agreeing to. She agreed still now, knowing exactly what it meant, which was everything. The day opened up around them the way good days did in West Texas, wide and generous and lit from a sky that went on forever, and the Mercer Bailey Ranch went about its morning, and the white gate post stood at the entrance to the east road exactly as it had always stood, and all of it was whole and sound, and thoroughly at rest.